I would like to really thank you from the bottom of my heart, just because you folks, stayed up until at this hour. That's really precious for us. Thanks once again. I hope you enjoyed the DevFest. I hope it was a nice experience for you. I hope you met a lot of nice people. I hope you will be having some opportunities deriving from this event. So that was very important for us, and I hope we have reached that goal. Okay, so in this talk, we're going to talk about Google's Firebase technology and its Auth best practices. The reason why the title goes with Auth is because there's actually two concepts that are often get confused. And we're going to basically deep dive into these and talk about the differences between them and see an introductory level of how you can actually implement these flows in your applications or in your backend services. I tried to keep it not very technical so that everyone can understand in any level, but I think it should be fine. If you will be having questions about it, you can always reach out to me from LinkedIn. All right, so my name is Atakan Zengin once again. I'm a software engineer at GSK, although sometimes I don't like this term because it's kind of confusing for some people. For example, to give a story, I had a meeting with my manager in GSK with a, let's say, high-level person in one of the organizations. And this person was running a whole function with, I think, around 2,500 people. And he was quite important. And in this meeting, he was actually going to request some ad hoc technological solution to one of his problems. When we first met, basically, he asked me what I'm doing in GSK, and I just simply answered, I'm a problem solver. That's the easiest that I can go, because this is what we do at the end of the day. And he really liked that answer, actually, and we did solve his problem, because that's what it matters at the end of the day. As Mihalina was talking about, your customers, your stakeholders should be the most priority thing that you do in your job, because you are serving to them and you're building some products for them. All right, so these two words, authentication and authorization, as I said before, they get confused a lot. Authorization is important, and Google Firebase provides a powerful and flexible way to implement authorization for your application based on security rules. Security rules are a feature of Google Firestore, Firebase Storage, and Firebase real-time database that helps you manage which data sets can be seen or manipulated by which user. But before we get there, you need to know who your users are. So for the rest of my time here, I'll be talking about a user authentication required to verify that a user is who they say they are, like a login system, for example. So basically, authentication means you are ensuring that this person who's trying to access your application is the person that they are saying. So you have to confirm this. Authorization, on the other part, is you're checking if that user has access or is authorized to that kind of data or that kind of processing. So this is the two different things. On authentication, you're checking the user who they are, if they're who they say are. And for the authorization, you just check how eligible or how many permissions they have to do such operations. So who here likes logging in? We each have, what, 50 or more applications on our phone? And each of those apps requires a separate login. That's not very convenient. It might be a bit of a hassle, but it is important. If you're storing data specific to one particular user, you want to be able to verify that only that user has access to that data set. It doesn't even need to be sensitive data, although authentication would be especially needed in such a case, of course. You might need to restrict the number of users and create scarcity for your application. Or maybe you have front-end admin panel for your application, or a content management system that only a select few should have access. In all of these scenarios, we have to implement some sort of an user authentication, and it's very critical for your applications. So my first bit of advice to you, as a best practice, to use authentication. Don't ever allow people to randomly go anywhere and do whatever they want in your application. that can maybe stay alive up until to that some point, but if you're in a professional environment, you'll get some emails from some people that you will not like. So have a policy that ensures the security of your application data and of your user data. So by verifying your users' identities and implement the right technology that matches your policy. So what are your options, you might ask? You might be considering writing your own custom authentication system, but I wouldn't recommend this because ask yourself instead if you'd rather use an implementation that was battle-tested over time or just write it on your own. For example, Google and others concerned with this security have teams 24/7 working on their auth systems to make them battle-ready. So to make them more secure and to make them more convenient for your users. That's why you benefit from this kind of products like Firebase Auth. You can just focus on implementing your business-critical features instead of going over the hassle of creating an actual system of authentication. Because it's just a part of your product, but it's not the product that your customer is waiting for. They don't accept you to write an on-long system because at the end of the day, your customer will not care which technology that you used. They will just care if their product is working and if it's fast enough, and that's it. So Firebase offers many options that can accommodate your authentication needs. So many apps require their users to create an account before you can use them, actually. And this is a bad idea, as it can lead to a drop-off in the users of the application who actually tried the app in the first place, but then they just wanted to leave the app because it's showing these very cumbersome login pages. So you just want to do something simple in the application. You just want to try it out, but it doesn't allow you. That's not a good idea. So authentication is important, but it shouldn't be a barrier for your application's usage. We like to browse before we commit to an application. So how can we have our cake and eat it too? You probably have heard about the concept of guest accounts. You can try out an app or a service, and once you want to actually commit to this application or perform an actual transaction in this application, you will be asked to sign in. But before that, you can still browse the application. That's a very convenient thing. That's why most of the applications, the modern applications, have this anonymous authentication system. Firebase has a feature that allows you to implement guest accounts. It's called Firebase Anonymous Authentication. Very simple name. It's a great option for onboarding users by first assigning a temporary unique user ID to each visitor, just like a guest account. And later, you can invite them to upgrade to a named account by connecting with one of the Firebase's authentication providers. So for web applications, you can import sign-in anonymously. As you can see at the top, we're importing it from the Firebase Auth SDK. But be sure to call it as early as possible in your app's lifecycle before you make any calls to other Firebase services that requires a user ID. That way, your users' interactions with your app can be paired with the guest's assigned UID.
Finally, some code.
Yeah, and it's readable, I hope. So logging in anonymously invokes the on-auth stage change listener. And the user object, as you can see, it's actually passed into the listener's callback here. And you can basically do some processing based on here. You can reach the user's unique identification or something else in the if user is signed out. These codes are, of course, shortened for the brevity and for simplification for the presentation purposes. When signing in anonymously, the user's ID is stored securely on the user's device in a storage area that can be accessed only by your application. So as you might suspect, this means that an anonymous user is closely tied to user's device and the application they're using. On the flip side, this means that this user cannot sign into their anonymous account on any of their other devices. That's probably not what your users expect, which is to be able to access all of their data in your application, no matter which platform they're on. Well, the key is to convert anonymous users to permanent user by connecting their user ID to an authentication system with a permanent ID. When users are ready to commit to your application, they can go ahead and create an account, generating credentials with whichever permanent authentication system they've chosen. We'll talk about this a few moments later. And then by using account linking, you can upgrade guests into verified users. So as you can see, this link with credential function coming from the Firebase Auth SDK is used to link your guest account's credentials to the actual permanent user data that will be created. So this mechanism actually allows us to copy that all credential data to the actual user who will be there permanent in your application. But where do these permanent credentials come from? And what is a good, secure, permanent authentication system? Let's first consider an email and password option. Users are familiar with this manner of logging in, and they really only need one password to have complete access to an application and its data. It's a seasoned and nearly ubiquitous approach, so it must be good and secure, right? I don't think so. OK. For the email and password authentication, by using the password, by using the Firebase SDK, as you can see, you can use the create user with email and password function to handle that flow. So it seems like one line of code does the job. But there's more to do than you might think. You might need to implement all the flows required to make it adequately secure. An email verification flow and a password reset flow, for example. Because these are flows that can be, let's say, interfered by bad actors, as we call hackers. So you have to think about more than just actually having an email and password option. That's not the best way to go. That's because email and password authentication is single-factor authentication. The reason is emails are public or easy to guess, and there is only one single piece of data that actually protects your access to the application, and that's the password. Unfortunately, passwords alone are unreliable gatekeepers because hackers might try to coax passwords from users or even use brute force algorithms to figure them out. So what can we do? How about getting rid of the password altogether? That's not as extreme an idea as you might think, because passwords are often not strong enough. Some users create passwords that are easy for them to remember, which weakens the password security. Additionally, some users have the exact same password for multiple applications. So if one of them is hacked, all of the application that he's using will be also hacked, and the access to all of that data will be available to the hackers. That's a very bad thing to do. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you're using the same password for multiple applications. Don't do that. That's not a good idea in a tech event. So that's why we need to. Additionally, there's also this good password recovery flow that you need to implement, or this email reset flows, et cetera, et cetera. There's too many things that you have to do if you go with the email and password option. So Firebase has an email link authentication option with no password required. Let me show you. So here's how it works in a web application. First, you need to enable email link for your application in the Firebase console, and then use the action code settings objects to instruct Firebase how to construct the email. These settings, along with the user's email address, are passed to send sign-in link to email. And the user is sent an email with a link. I'm sure that some of you have already come up with this or ran into this situation. When you want to log in, you're receiving an email, and then you're clicking this button, and then you're being redirected to it, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is, with this option, you should save the user's email address, as you will be needing it later once the user actually clicks the email link. And here in this example, we're using the local storage to basically store this email in the browser's own local storage. Next, the app needs to respond when the user clicks on that email that you have sent and use the URL to complete the login. This code is a bit simplified. For example, if there's no email saved in local storage, then it could mean that the user clicked that link on a different device and will need to enter it again. But when the user clicks that email link, the account is verified and the user is signed in. As an added benefit, the user's email address is also verified in the login process. So that's kind of a convenient thing if you think about it. It's a low-hassle authentication system for the user, and best of all, the user doesn't need to memorize any of the passwords. Alternatively, you could provide your users options to log in using a third-party identity provider that they trust. So for example, Firebase has software development kits that work with several federated identity providers, including Google Sign-In with Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and GitHub. I'm not going to ask you how much you trust these companies, but I think you know what you want to do. Which should you use? Well, it makes sense to use the identity provider that matches its respective platform. So Google Sign-In for the Android and Sign-In with Apple for iOS. For example, that's how you can actually map them. But keep in mind, though, that if you support one of these mechanisms for your application on one platform, you should also support that same mechanism on all the other platforms your app runs on too. Otherwise, a user who has an Android phone and then an iPad might not be able to sign into your application on all of their devices. Here's an example of using Google Sign-In with a web application. This uses the option to sign in with a redirect to Google's login page. I'm sure you also run into this flow in the application that you're using. Using a redirect is the preferred method on mobile devices, usually. But there is one thing to note here is that a redirect doesn't work on browsers that block third-party cookies. Luckily, there are some solutions to this that provide a link. So here's sign-in with Apple. Instead of a redirect, this uses the sign-in with pop-up version. There's an important requirement to know about with Apple, because they're so precious company, yeah. If you use any federated identity provider on an application you want to publish on the App Store, either as a native iOS application or a Flutter application, doesn't really matter, then you also need to use sign-in with Apple. If you're going to use Apple's own App Store, you have to use sign-in with Apple. That's something that they actually kind of mandate. But it's a good idea, even if it weren't mandated, because Apple users expect to be able to sign in with Apple, and it's worthwhile to maintain that good user experience. You may hear from Apple users, I'm one of them, by the way, why do they choose Apple is just because of the ecosystem that it provides. Yeah, even with a subscription, I can even hide my email, for example, for some random website, but I have to give some access to it. So that's a very nice thing. That's why Apple has this kind of access system, and that's why it mandates this kind of behavior for the app developers. If you have upgraded your app to use Firebase authentication with identity platform, then more options become available, including adding multi-factor authentication. So how many of you have heard about multi-factor authentication by raising of hands? That's nice. OK, that's a good number. I see that you saw it very well. Yeah, multi-factor authentication is more secure than single-factor authentication, of course, because of the addition of a hard-to-intercept second factor, such as an email or a text message. But there is some more options that I will be talking about. Let's consider the text message option first. So Firebase supports sending an SMS text message as a second factor. You've probably used this before to log into an application. These kind of SMSs are quite, let's say, common. If you implement SMS, however, be sure to take your users into consideration, because you have to think, is there really an expectation that a phone message is part of a login system? Also, you will need to build a flow for changing the phone number, because your users might actually travel to some other country and they get some other kind of phone number, and what? Then if they can't change their phone number, they're not going to be able to access your application. That's not something we want as developers. So we have to think about this very carefully, depending on our users' let's say, context as well. A better and more secure option is to use a time-based one-time password. There you go, as TOTP, as you can see in the slide as well, with an authenticator app like Google Authenticator, which generates a new code every few seconds. How many of you are using Google Authenticator or something like that TOTP application? That's good. I would recommend you to do it because it adds a really nice additional layer of security. And I think it's the most convenient way because you don't really need to think about anything else, because it's just an application that runs on your mobile everywhere you go. So let's take a look at how to implement it in your own application. TOTP would be a second factor. one that comes after a first authentication. So this code uses sign-in with email and passwords, as we have seen before. If that sign-in is successful, then a second factor hasn't yet been set up. But if it fails with the specific message of multi-factor auth required, then we can move on to the next step to check the TOTP stuff. Once we find which TOTP resolver is being used, for example, Google Authenticator, we request and then read the one-time password from the user. At that point, we can use the assertion for sign-in method from the SDK of Firebase Auth to resolve the second authentication factor. And that's it, basically highly secure multi-factor authentication in a very convenient way by just a couple of lines of code. One more thing I want to bring up, not strictly about authentication, but rather complementary to it. So if you have a Firebase app, there is something called app check, Firebase app check. It's important to enough consider part of Auth best practices. Here's why. App check protects your app's backend by gating all requests. You can think this as a firewall, for example, in the network level, including your authentication requests and verifying that traffic comes from your application and not from some other source. If you have written some backend services before, maybe you know what's called a course. Yes. Yep. OK. So there you also have something similar, allow origins. You can basically limit your application to accept requests to a specific set of, let's say, domains or some configurations. That's kind of how it works here as well. So it verifies the traffic if it comes from your application or not. You can register your app in the Firebase console, so you can get protection from app check by default. Or that's why the best time to do is this before you roll out your application, actually, because that's where things are very easy. Because when your application gets complex, it's hard to do this kind of stuff. But you can even add it to any application that actually exists already and you already shipped, for example. The documentation contains much more detailed information about the app checks. You'll be finding it more in the Google's Firebase documentation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a Firebase backend service. It can be also a custom service backend that you have written as well. Thank you so much. That was it. It was a kind of a short talk. Yep. Since this was the last speech, I wanted to keep it short. I know all of you are tired, includes me as well. So I hope you really enjoyed the event. I hope you enjoyed the speech about Firebase. If you have some questions about it, you can always feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you scan this code, you have to. I think you should go to the LinkedIn page. I hope it works. Feel free to connect with me. In any kind of question, you can reach out to me. Thanks again.